like to introduce this week's lesson with a song by the Kingsmen. Excuses, excuses, you hear them every day, and the devil, he'll supply them if the church you stay away. When people come to know the Lord, the devil always loses. So to keep them folks away from church, he offers them excuses. In the summer it's too hot, and in the winter it's too cold. In the springtime when the weather's just right, you'll find someplace else to go. Well, it's up to the mountains or down to the beach, or to visit some old friend, or just to stay home and kind of relax and hope the kinfolks start to drop in. Well, the church benches are too hard and the choir sings too loud. Boy, you know how nervous you get when you're sitting in a great big crowd. The doctor told you, now you better watch out, them crowds, they'll set you back. But you go to that old ball game because you say it helps you to relax. Well, the headache's Sunday morning and a backache Sunday night, but by work time Monday morning, you're feeling quite all right. While one of the children has a cold, pneumonia, do you suppose? Why, the whole family had to stay home just to blow that poor kid's nose. Excuses, excuses, you hear them every day, and the devil, he'll supply them if the church you stay away. When people come to know the Lord, the devil always loses. So to keep them folks away from church, he offers them excuses. Well, the preacher, he's too young, and maybe he's too old. The sermons, they're not hard enough, and sometimes they're too bold. His voice is much too quiet-like, and sometimes he's way too loud. He needs to have more dignity, or else he's way too proud. Well, the sermons, they're too long, and sometimes they're too short. He ought to preach a word with dignity instead of stomp and snort. Well, the preacher we've got must be the world's most stuck-up man. One of the ladies told me just the other day, well, he didn't even shake my hand. Excuses, excuses, you hear them every day, and the devil, he'll supply them if the church you stay away. When people come to know the Lord, the devil always loses. So to keep them folks away from church, he offers them excuses. So to keep them folks away from church, he offers them excuses. Excuses. We're all pretty good at manufacturing reasons to justify why we aren't in church or why we're not involved in ministry, and many as to why they don't believe in God at all. Well, in today's Lenten message, Jesus continues to heap it on the religious leaders by telling them another parable, this time about a banquet that a king had prepared for his son's wedding. Now, obviously, not everyone gets invited to a royal wedding, only those who are chosen. The king sent servants to invite the chosen people, and he prepared a feast for them, killing the ox and cattle, decorating the banquet hall, and securing the wine. In those days, 2 invitations were sent out, the first inviting the guests to the up-and-coming wedding, and then, when the day arrived, a second invitation was given, letting the people know that it was time now to come and celebrate. However, the invited guests failed to RSVP. So the king sent more servants to tell them that the feast was ready, but again, they failed to respond to the invitation. Some made excuses. Matthew says that one went to his business and another to his field. In Luke's record, he tells us that they asked to be excused. The first man saying that he had bought a field and he needed to go and inspect it. The second said that he had just bought a pair of oxen and needed to try them out. And the third gave the excuse that he had just been married himself and he needed to spend time with his new bride. In Jesus' day, a wedding feast, they were a big deal, just like they are today. However, they usually lasted 7 days, and the guests were expected to participate in all 7 days. And so to accept an invitation required one to sacrifice time and probably money. For some of the poor, this would have been difficult. However, the poor would not have ever been invited to a royal wedding, so these were wealthy people, the favored people, and they rejected the king's invitation. Now, as the father and the landowner represented God in the previous two parables, so does the king now represent God in this parable, and the son again is Jesus. Those guests who initially received the invitation are the Jewish people, specifically the Jewish religious leaders. The invitation they received was to accept Jesus as the Messiah and obey his words. The servants who delivered the invitation the first time, well, they were the prophets. The king then sent more servants to tell them that the feast for his son was ready, but the invited guests continued to make excuses. But not all. Some, annoyed with the servants, attacked and murdered them. The second group of servants referred to John the Baptist and the disciples, who were all killed, with the exception of John. The invitation is loud and clear. They just chose to ignore it and go about life like the invitation had never been offered. Now, the hearers of this parable would have been amazed at the foolishness of those who rejected the invitation and the dangerous actions that they took. First of all, it was a huge honor to be invited to a royal wedding. Second, to ignore the king's invitation would have been rude and seen as disloyal. And third, servants of the king had high status, even higher than that of free persons. Further, the servant represented the king, so to kill the servant was tantamount to killing the king, and it was a sign of revolt. So what is the king to do? Well, he's going to squash any rebellion. Matthew 22:7 says, the king enraged, and he sent an army to destroy the murderers and to burn their city. Now, the king has spent a lot of time and effort readying the banquet. The hall is decorated, the food is prepared, the wine is poured, and the table is set. And to have no guest at his son's wedding would have been a huge dishonor and embarrassment. Because of their refusal to accept the king's invitation, those invited, the chosen, the Jews, are now no longer worthy. And so the king extends his invitation to all commoners. The servants are to go out and call everyone, the good and the bad. The message here is the same as it was in the vineyard parable. The religious leaders are thrown out of the vineyard. The Jewish people lose their favored status, and the Gentiles are now brought in. Matthew 22:10 says, they were to invite the good and the bad. And the idea is that of a fishing dragnet. You throw the net out into the water and you pull it in. All the fish are pulled in together and brought into the boat to be later separated, the good from the bad. Those initially invited were considered the good, the righteous. They were the Jewish people, God's chosen. And everyone else who were called Gentiles, well, they were considered unrighteous and the bad. Thus, this is saying that the king now is inviting both Jew and Gentile alike. So the hall is filled with people, and the celebration begins. However, as the king makes his rounds welcoming his guest, he notices a man who is not wearing the wedding clothes. As the guests arrived to the feast, they would have been given a robe to wear, a wedding robe. To not dress properly was a sign of disrespect toward the host, who at this point is in no mood for any more contempt. The wedding clothes in the parable symbolize righteousness. In our other New Testament lesson today, Revelation 19:6-7, it tells us that at the wedding of the Lamb, which will occur when Christ returns and takes all believers to heaven, the bride, who represents all believers, will have to make herself ready. She will have to put on fine linen, wedding clothes. Revelation 19:8 tells us that the fine linen stands for the righteous acts of the believers, the good works done by faith. You see, this man, by coming to the wedding, said he believed, said that he had faith, but his clothes, his deeds, said otherwise. His worldly clothes represented that which he did, which was nothing for the kingdom, and proved his faith was false. It was not true. So the king, being gentle, calls this man a friend, and he asked him, "How did you get in?" Basically, he's giving him a chance to redeem himself, to explain himself. But the man is speechless, for he has no answer, letting the king know that he is no friend of the crown. The king then has him bound and thrown outside into the darkness, where there was much weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus concludes by saying, "For many are invited, but few are chosen." And what he's saying is that everyone has been invited, both Jew and Gentile, but few respond. Not all are receptive to Jesus. Those previously known as the chosen, the Jews, they're no longer the chosen because they didn't respond and accept the invitation to Jesus. From here on forward, the people are chosen by their willingness to respond positively to the Messiah. Those who are called chosen are those who put their faith in Jesus Christ. However, some will say with their mouths that they believe, but refuse to obey. They refuse to put on the clothes of righteousness, and they're sorted out and rejected. This reminds us that when we say yes to Christ and agree to follow him, that it is a serious undertaking, not to be taken lightly. It is not enough just to say, "Yes, I believe." We must respond with faithful obedience and action. Many in the parable made excuses for not accepting the king's invitation. And unfortunately, many today continue to make excuses for not accepting the Lord's invitation to faith. It's not that busyness is necessarily a bad thing, or that taking care of one's fields or work or even one's spouse is bad. Most people who reject God's invitation are not involved in bad activities. They're just involved in the everyday affairs of the world, of life, and are too busy to seriously think about what they are or not doing. They're too occupied with planning for life in this world, building up their material wealth in preparation for life after retirement instead of life after death. But it is imperative that we think about how we spend and manage our time. For God's invitation is not a suggestion, it is a command. God is saying, "I request your presence at my son's wedding." If your king, your Lord, asked you to do something, shouldn't you do it? To reject his invitation is to reject God, which is sin. Further, if we don't use the opportunities we have right now, we may find that the door is shut in our face. In Luke's telling, some outright refuse the king's invitation, and others say, "Have me excused," meaning, "I won't come this time, but maybe next." But they never got a next time. Isaiah 55:6 says, "Seek the Lord while he may be found." Friends, we've all been invited to the wedding banquet. Some people will just simply say, "No, I'm not interested." But many make excuses for why it's not a good time for them, saying, "No, Lord, I'm not ready to get involved just yet, but keep me in mind for the next time. But right now I have my own things I want to do and not much time to do them, so please excuse me, maybe next time." But we aren't guaranteed a next time. This may be our last invitation. So my friends, choose this day whom you will serve. Blessings.